Hello and welcome once again to another edition of the SaskAgToday.com Roundtable. I'm your host, Doug Falconer, Agriculture Director at GX94 in Yorkton. We're joined by the Chief Agricultural Editor for SaskAgToday.com, Kevin Hursh, and 620 CKRM AgriNews Director, Ryan Young. Hello, everybody. And of course, it's been a busy week in the agriculture business. Probably the biggest news, or perhaps more appropriately, non-news, was the federal budget. And that was something I know you followed up on, Ryan, quite a bit.
Yeah, and right off the bat, I spoke with Keith Curry, the president of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, and Kyle Larkin, the executive director of the Grain Growers of Canada. And like you said, Doug, right off the bat, they were pretty disappointed with the lack of inclusiveness agriculture had in the federal budget. In fact, Kyle said that he counted on his fingers pretty much 6 times the word agriculture was mentioned in the federal budget. So for him, it just goes to show how much of a priority agriculture is for the federal government at this current time. But he mentioned that there is a number of items that were missing, ranging from investments to other programs and incentives and all that. Same thing with Keith Curry with the Canadian Federation of Agriculture saying the same thing. But what they were able to glean on with some of the items included in the federal budget, they were pleased to see some consultations will launch in June around the proposed amendments rather, to the Copyright Act to support interoperability of farm equipment. Although they did caution that it was announced in last year's federal budget, so they're waiting with bated breath as to whether they'll actually happen this summer or not. One of the other mentions was the livestock tax deferral. There was a paragraph in the budget about that. Looking at the news release here now from the Canadian Cattle Association, they kind of talked about that, and they're kind of cautiously optimistic about some meaningful changes being made to the tax deferral just to make it more responsive to, times of drought or flooding or any sort of extreme weather events, that farmers can have cash readily available on hand and support on hand to get through those ordeals. So we'll see where that goes from there. So those are kind of the initial reaction from around the agriculture sector. Not a whole lot, but from what was there, cautiously optimistic.
Kevin, your reaction to the federal budget?
A lot of people are going to be watching the changes to capital gains inclusion. And coming up next week, I'll have an interview with the chief, excuse me, agriculture specialist with MNP about what the changes to capital gains tax mean. And I'm almost hesitant to try to encapsulate the changes. But on the good side, the lifetime capital gains exemption is being increased from just over $1 million to $1.25 million, which would seem to be good news. But once you've used all that up, or if you're a corporation, the tax inclusion, it used to be that 50% of a capital gain had to be included as income. And now on anything over $250,000 for an individual and anything for a corporation, the inclusion rate as of June 25th is going to be 2/3 or 66.6%. So there actually may be people that are on the borderline as to maybe selling farmland or whatever, and looking at this June 25th implementation date for the changes in capital gains tax inclusion, that may want to have a look at that and how that's going to affect their financial position. But some of the other things that Ryan mentioned, I think it will be a real good thing if they put some parameters around the livestock tax deferral as to exactly when it kicks in a particular area, so people can predict it more fully. And one of the other things in the budget that had already been announced and we already knew about it was the interest in, or the increase in the interest-free cash advance to $250,000.
All right, so that federal budget came down on Tuesday afternoon. Then I believe it was Wednesday, we had another precipitation event pass through Saskatchewan. And Ryan, I know you're in Regina normally. That's where you work out of. Did you guys get much snow or rain out of that storm?
Unfortunately, there was just enough to kind of get an acknowledgement that there was a storm. My wife that morning, she looked outside the window and noticed that it was snowing. And when I looked out the window, it was just a little bit of a skiffle of snow, but mostly rain or a little bit of snowflakes, a bit of a mix of both. Whenever the snowflakes came down, they melted on contact with the ground. So we did have some moisture, but nothing compared to like Saskatoon or where I am here today as of this recording in St. Brew visiting my mother. They got a dump of snow here and in Saskatoon as well. It was like winter all over again. So, just kind of when you thought that we were kind of move on and, gear up towards seeding, uh, not so fast just yet. We got one more snow dump here. Although on the positive side, it'll be really good for farmers around these areas, to get that added moisture for the topsoil and for that to really replenish the moisture in the ground and really get off to a good start with seeding later this season.
There were reports of a lot of snow in that Flin Flon, the Paw, Swan River, over to Hudson Bay, Melfort, North Battleford, Saskatoon. You were in Saskatoon, Kevin. You're not there at the moment, but did Saskatoon get a fair bit of snow?
Yeah, my wife's in Saskatoon. The youngest son just came down to the farm at Keebrey where I'm at. But yeah, reports are quite a bunch of snow in Saskatoon. Here at the farm in southwest Saskatchewan, my machine registered 9 or 10 millimeters of rain before the snow cut in, and we've had an inch or two of snow a couple of times. It tends to melt after that. I would suspect we've had maybe the equivalent of half an inch of moisture, which isn't a great deal, but anything is welcome. So even though there were producers gearing up and would have been seeding by now had the weather held, nobody's complaining at all. Just happy to see anything that's wet.
Yeah, here in Yorkton, we didn't get a whole lot, I don't think, of snow anyway. We had some rain on Wednesday. It turned to snow overnight Thursday. Snowed a little bit Thursday morning into Thursday afternoon. But looking out on my window here right now, it's just the odd little tuft of snow here and there. So, and I guess maybe that bodes well because the GX94 Supper in the Field starts this coming Wednesday. So hopefully we might be in a field, but I'm kind of doubting it right now. It's a little too cold and might be a little too damp yet for anyone to actually do any field work in this part of the province.
It's going to be a little while here drying up and getting going again too. There were sprayers going and reports of a few people with some early seeding before the weather turned. But it's going to be a few days now. Although the forecast ahead looks like in 3 or 4 days time things might be back on the drying side and people out in the field again.
Another report that came out this week was from Farm Credit Canada, and they were suggesting that it might be more affordable for farmers right now to be renting land than to buying land. What's your take on that news, Kevin?
It's an interesting analysis, and people always like to own land rather than rent land, but the price of land has continued to go up. Interest rates are still high compared to what we've seen in recent times. So the cost of a principal and interest payment on land, certainly in the FCC analysis, it shows quite clearly that that's well above most of the cash rental values. Everybody has to make their own decisions about what they're doing, but from their analysis, it shows that from a cash point of view, you're certainly cash ahead and cash plus to be renting rather than paying off newly purchased farmland. So interesting analysis, and it has shifted over time. Cash rental rates haven't increased as fast as farmland prices have increased, especially when you consider the higher interest rate on top of those farmland price increases.
And Ryan, if I recall correctly, I believe you do own some farmland that you rent out. Is that still the case?
Yes, that is. I own a parcel of land back home around the Margot area and just have one parcel of land, 160 acres, renting it out to a neighbor of ours. In fact, I've been renting for probably close to 8 or 9 years now. And so far, it's been a good experience. Really haven't had any issues in terms of the gentleman who's renting the land or how his crops have been doing. He said he's been getting some good yields and he's been doing fairly well. So we really haven't had any issues in terms of rent or anything like that. So all good on this end.
And is it normally cash rent nowadays? Is that how rentals usually handle? I remember when I was a kid, it was like, oh, it's a third, two thirds is how they would do it. I think mainly now it's cash rent, right?
I think cash rent has become more and more common, and the two-thirds, one-third formula really doesn't work very well anymore, uh, considering where costs have gone. But sometimes there is some sort of crop sharing agreement. Sometimes there's even agreements with minimums and maximums on cash rent, and it varies according to the profitability or gross returns. So there are people that play with the formula and try to protect people on both ends. But I think you're right, Doug. By and large, it's how many dollars per acre, and the cash rent has really become the simplest way, especially for larger operators.
And Kevin, of course, you have farmland there at Cabri. Do you own all of that, or is it rented out, or you rent some, or how does it work for you?
Majority is owned. Rent a little bit from neighbors, but pretty small. Do some swapping of land back and forth with some cattle farming neighbors where they grow green feed barley or silage barley on some of my land, and I take a similar amount of their acreage to grow specialty crops. So we do some trading that way, but over and above that, do rent a little bit. But in my case, the no 90% of it would be owned.
And of course, there hasn't been a whole lot of news on the avian flu slash bovine flu in the United States. As we talked about it last week, it's been in dairy cattle in the US, and we did hear an explanation this week as to why it's dairy cattle and not beef cattle. They're suggesting it might be being passed back and forth through milking equipment. What's your take on that, Kevin?
Well, and plus they seem to think the vector is things like pigeons and blackbirds uh, rather than migratory waterfowl. I know on the roundtable last week we were musing as to why it would be affecting dairy cattle and not having been found in beef cattle. But if the vector is not migratory birds and instead is the birds that might be kicking around a dairy facility, that does make some sense. But I think the market is still a little spooked until this all plays out. But so far, no terrible news or nothing that looks like the situation is going to escalate. But I think they also continue to try to unravel the transmission and just what it all means.
And the big announcement out of Saskatoon today was that the Saskatchewan government is increasing their amount of funding to the Western College of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan. It seems like the intent is to have more rural veterinarians who can handle farm animals. Obviously, good news, Ryan.
Yeah, that is good news. I concur with that. I know one of our colleagues in Saskatoon was covering that announcement. Kevin, what were your kind of thoughts when you heard that announcement?
Well, there's a tremendous shortage of rural vets. And quite frankly, people become veterinarians and they quickly learn that the money is made in companion animals and dealing with dogs and cats rather than getting the bejeebers kicked out of you with a cow in a muddy corral in the middle of a snowstorm. So it's tough to get people that will be rural vets and deal with the large animal issues, and because the money is much better in the companion animals. So anything they can do to encourage more rural veterinarians is really important for the livestock industry.
Well, that's going to do it for this week's edition of the Roundtable. On behalf of 620 CKRM Regina Agri-News Director Ryan Young and SaskAgToday.com Chief Agricultural Editor Kevin Hursh, I'm Doug Falconer from GX94 in Yorkton, saying so long until next week.